Hello, everyone. Welcome to Ruminate This with Agrarian Solutions. Join us as we explore ruminant nutrition and the impact of mycotoxins. Here, we challenge your curiosity and explore new industry insights and research to optimize your herd's health and performance. Hey, everybody. Welcome to another episode of Ruminate This with Agrarian Solutions. I'm your host, Scott Zehr. And today I'm going to be joined by one of my friends, somebody I'm proud to call a friend, a YDLI 12 alumni, just like me, Dr. I think that's got such a great ring to it. I'm so proud of you. Dr. Alycia Drwencke.
Thank you, Scott.
So, Alycia, I want to start by first saying thanks for coming on Ruminate This. I'm excited to dive into what we're going to talk about today, which is your research project in calf pain management during like dehorning, that sort of thing. But before we do, let's give everybody a little bit of a backstory of who you are, where you're at in the world, what have you been doing, and then I'll let you dive into what your research was on to, your PhD.
Perfect. Yeah. So a little bit of background on myself. I originally am from Michigan. So I spent a majority of my young adulthood there and did my undergrad at Michigan State University in the animal science department. And kind of throughout my undergrad was one of those people that thought I wanted to go to vet school and decided that that wasn't actually the best fit for me. So from there, I chose to go to graduate school. And first, I received a master's in animal biology from the University of California, Davis. So when I first moved there, it was kind of the exciting thing to get out of the Midwest and go to the West Coast. And I studied heat stress in dairy cattle. From there, I spent about 2 years working for Cornell Cooperative Extension in the Southwest New York region. So just kind of bouncing back and forth across the US. And after about 2 years with Cornell, I chose to go back and pursue my PhD, again at the University of California, Davis, focusing on calf behavior and welfare, specifically, as you mentioned, around disbudding. And I completed that in March and recently started a position with Novus International as a technical services specialist working with their cows program. So excited to talk more about my research. Of course, I'm very passionate about it. So I always appreciate when I have the opportunity to speak a little bit more about it.
Yeah. And so, we've talked in the past at different conferences we've been at about some of the things that you guys saw during your research study. And I think where I want to start with this is walk us through like just the simple pros and cons, right, of disbudding.
Yeah. So I guess one of the things that I kind of like to talk about first when I'm talking about disbudding is that it's very common in the US, which probably isn't surprising to you or any of the listeners. It occurs on about 94% of farms in the United States. And there's two kind of primary methods that farms are using to perform this procedure. One is with a hot iron that creates a heat burn to prevent horn growth. And then the second is with caustic paste. And caustic paste creates a chemical burn to prevent horn growth. And of course, we also have kind of the alternative of not doing this procedure altogether, either by using polled genetics or by leaving cattle horned. But there are some different conversations to be had around kind of whether we do this procedure at all or if we use kind of some of these alternatives. But yeah, so kind of high level pros and cons. Of course, anytime that you do perform the disbudding procedure, it is going to cause pain for the calves. And so if we can start to utilize things like polled genetics, that is going to be best from the calf's perspective. And it's also going to be easier on the humans, right? We don't have to actually spend the time to go out and do this procedure. We don't have to provide pain relief because we just don't have to do it at all. So it's less stress.
Oh, it's one less thing.
Yeah, exactly. Less stress on the calves, less stress on the humans, for sure.
Okay. I mean, 90, would you say 94% of the animals are being dehorned, right, in the US? So let's talk about that side of it. So one, like gouging has gone away completely, right? Hopefully.
It is supposed to not be
with the big
conducted.
breaker, right?
Yeah, it's not supposed to be occurring anymore. That is no longer allowed under the National Milk FARM program.
Yeah.
We do see some instances where farms will use that as a cleanup method. So later in life, if they have horn regrowth, we do see some farms use kind of the scooping, but that
Yep.
should not be anybody's primary method of disbudding. So if anybody
Okay.
is listening doing that, maybe move away from that.
Yeah. So now coming down to the hot iron burn or the chemical burn, right? I've had experience with both on my dad's farm. Honestly, I always, and this is just my own brain, but I always felt like the hot iron was maybe a little better in the sense that like I've been burned before and I've been chemically burned before, and the chemical
Mhm.
burn seems to hurt a hell of a lot worse. So is that what you guys saw in the calves?
Yeah, no, that's a great point. And I am interested or intrigued by your perspective because I feel like a lot of times I hear the opposite from folks where they think the paste is actually better for the calves. And because there's been such a strong perception that the paste is better, we've seen that it's become much more common in the US. But until kind of my PhD, we had very little research that was actually conducted on this method of disbudding and very few research projects that had compared hot iron to caustic paste in kind of an apples to apples way, I'll say. And ultimately, what I found throughout my PhD is that you are actually very much correct that the hot iron is better from the calf's perspective in terms of pain and healing. So we are better able to mitigate the pain associated with the hot iron because when we provide pain relief, it's effective during the time when we're doing the procedure. But for the paste, it continues to burn for a very long period of time, and we don't actually know how long it continues to burn for. So if you think about it, it's wet when you put it on, and it continues to absorb into the skin for multiple hours and continues to create that burning sensation. And so, in a lot of instances, even if you're giving a local block or a NSAID for pain relief, that's going to wear off while that caustic paste is still burning. So, the hot iron, we're better able to manage the pain associated with the procedure. But then we also see that the wounds from the hot iron heal twice as fast as those from the caustic paste. So on average, a new layer of skin is formed in 7 to 9 weeks from a hot iron. And for caustic paste, it takes 14 to 18 weeks.
Just hearing that explanation, like to me, again, it makes perfect sense. Like you burn your hand and remove the heat source. Yeah, it's sore for a day. You know, I burnt my finger actually 2 nights ago right here making some maple pecans, but it was fine the next day. But I've spilled acid. I had some really bad chlorine burns on my hands when I was running my catering business. My
Mm-hmm.
hands hurt for 2 days, 2 to 3 days.
Mm-hmm.
Like it sucked.
Yeah.
So I guess that to me that makes perfect sense. And it's like, what a shocker. Common sense, wins the day. What I'm curious, like, did you guys look at intakes on these calves
We
when under the
um
two different strategies?
we didn't necessarily look at intake. We did look at average daily gain in one of my experiments, but we did not see any differences between that experiment with just caustic paste versus non-dysphotic controls. But we didn't see any differences in average daily gain. But one of the things that I think that feeds into that is that the animals in my experiment and in many experiments were kind of on a limit fed milk diet. So they were getting about 6 liters of milk per day, which we know is limit feeding milk for calves. So
Yeah.
it would be interesting to look at those results in a situation where the calves are being fed a higher plane of milk. So something more like the 8, 10, 12 liters of milk per day that we know calves will choose to consume very readily.
Yeah. What about in the way of any other like sicknesses?
Yeah,
Yeah, because
we
I guess the basis of my question is I'm thinking through Like, obviously, we created a stress, there's an immune response. Did we see any other secondary things pop up in either
Mhm.
group at a more prevalent rate?
Yeah, it's a good question. And for the project where I compared both methods, we did have a pretty high prevalence in all of the calves for sickness and disease. We didn't see really many infections specific to the hornbud, but we did see pretty high rates of sickness overall within our population. And I think that kind of goes back again to these calves are in a limit fed situation. They were all individually housed. They're experiencing pain from disbudding. This was also during the summer, so we add the heat component into it. So those calves were under a lot of stressors. So it was kind of hard to disentangle, is it the whole system? Is it specific to the disbudding method? But one thing I can speak to is that we collected a measure of pain that is called basically evoked pain or sensitivity, where we measured basically how much force can we apply around the wound before the calf responds. So you can maybe think of this for yourself, like when you've had those burns on your hand, if you touch it, you're going to pull away much sooner than the times when you don't have the burn on your hand, right? And so we basically do that with the calves and like measure and quantify how much force can we apply before they respond. And we found
So
that
we call that the Hertz donut method. It's when you hit, it hurts donut. So
yeah, exactly. And we found that for both the hot iron and the caustic paste, they had similar responses to that evoked response, that sensitivity. But what the difference was is that because the hot iron heals so much faster, that evoked pain goes away much sooner for those calves. Um,
yeah,
so I think that when we start to think about kind of some of these feeding questions that you're asking about and what are the potential effects on that, I think that's really where it could play in. But unfortunately, our experiment just didn't have quite the right setup. But if we're thinking about, especially like milk feeding, for example, and if they're feeding out of a bottle, we know that calves do a lot of headbutting, right? Even when they're feeding out of a bottle. So if they're experiencing this evoked pain when they're doing that headbutting, they're likely going to hit their heads on something and respond more frequently with that pain response. But so I think that would be something to also look at more as well is kind of we found this evoked pain. It's similar for both methods, but how does that then translate to auto feeders, for example, or yeah, some other housing and management systems, and how does that affect their intake in those settings?
I've seen it, right? I mean, I've fed calves enough too to see that even drinking out of a bucket, they'll smash their head, they jolt back.
Mm.
To your point, right? It'd be cool to look at. And as my colleague Dr. Roth likes to remind everybody, the perfect research trial has never been done. And so I guess that's why we have to keep doing research. But I think that's a big deal, though. I
Mhm.
mean, just thinking about it practically, right? So if we're healing that wound up quicker, like, doesn't it stand to reason they're going to want to eat quicker? They're going to eat more quicker. So it'd be really interesting, like you said, to look at that from a non-limited diet to where they, maybe not truly ad lib, but that 8 to 10 liter diet to see if there'd be any difference there.
And one thing that I didn't necessarily look at, but my colleague, she used the like ear tag behavior monitors, and she found this was with hot iron disbudding versus a non-disbudded animal. For 3 weeks after the procedure, the calves spent less time ruminating when they were disbudded. So I would expect we would see a similar response for the caustic paste, and that behavioral response may persist for longer since we see that the wounds last longer. So we do see kind of some of those feeding behaviors altered in different experiments. So I think there's definitely more questions to be asked, but I definitely agree that reason would stand to suggest that like calves are experiencing pain on their head, that's going to alter their feeding behavior and they're going to try to avoid that pain, right? So the more that we can do to A, reduce the need for this procedure by using things like pooled genetics, but then B, also use methods that are going to heal faster. So using the hot iron, and then of course, giving pain relief at the time of the procedure, all of those are going to be beneficial for the calves.
Alycia, do you think that for the dairy farms out there that are using paste now because of maybe the perceived convenience or, whatever, like, do you think this would have the ability to help change their perspective on this and maybe give them reason to think about going back to the hot iron?
Yeah, I definitely think that it does. And I can totally appreciate from, the farms out there that are using paste. It is objectively pretty easy to like walk by, put on some paste, not think about it anymore. But I think that that is kind of making the assumption that we don't need to provide the same level of pain relief for the calves that we do for the hot iron. And so in reality, we should be providing pain relief to those calves. So the labor component, theoretically, if we're following best practice, should be pretty similar.
That's a
But
good point.
yeah, and I personally have seen this data actually change producers' minds, which I thought was very touching. So the farm that I conducted one of my experiments on was a commercial dairy in the Central Valley of California, and they milk about 3,000 cows, and all of this hot iron versus paste research was conducted on their facility. And they were a farm who had been using hot iron. The dairyman himself used to have to do that chore when he was growing up, and he hated it. And so he switched to paste because he thought that it was much better for the calves, that it was less painful, and that ultimately he was doing a very kind things for the calves, which I totally appreciate. And so when I was conducting my research and I finished it up and showed him the results and showed him how much longer it took for the wounds to heal and show that there were similar levels of pain for the calves, he actually switched back. And I was able to help him kind of do some training with his employees, show them how to do best pain management practices, and kind of work through that transition back to the iron. And also talk about some of the practical things like, for example, some irons require a plug-in for electricity, but we also have the option to use like butane ones or some other gas powered ones or like more portable options that are more feasible depending on your setup. So I do think and have seen personally this data change dairy producers' minds. And I'm always happy to talk through that with farms if that's something that is of interest to them. I'm definitely more than happy to have those conversations and kind of help troubleshoot if that's of use for them or yeah, whatever is helpful for farms. I think we can see that this data will change their minds.
So with that, I will remind the audience that if you email us podcast at agrsol.com, I will be happy to put you in touch with Dr. Drwencke to go over some of that information with you or answer any questions you might have. And one other question I have, Alycia, too, is your research papers. Can we make those available in the show notes for the audience as
Yes,
well? Okay. Yeah,
please. I would love
we
that.
will do that. Yeah, we'll definitely do that. Just a few other things that I wanted to, I guess, bring up in terms of this. So do you have any data on like what percentage of polled genetics are out there currently? Was that part of your research?
No, unfortunately, it wasn't. It was something we talked about, but I don't currently have that information. It is something that I think the farm program is now asking about. So hopefully we'll start to see that data come out. Previously, kind of the organization that had been collecting that data was the USDA, and they did these like NAHMS surveys, so NAHMS, that kind of looked at basically animal management. But it seems like those surveys are probably not going to be conducted anymore. It would also be interesting to maybe talk to some of the semen companies to see if they have data on how much they're actually getting polled genetics used, because I would expect they would have those numbers as well. But I haven't personally seen any kind of comprehensive overview of 20% of animals are being bred polled or anything
Yeah,
like that.
yeah. I know in my time at Premier Select Sires, especially the last 2 years, so say 18, 19, and for part of 20, the requests for not just homozygous polled, but even heterozygous polled bulls was increasing. The drawback at that time, and again, that's 7 years ago now, was you were probably going to have to give up some net merit dollars to get that homozygous polled bull. But I'd say by the time that I left in 2020, there were some homozygous bulls that were like really competing at the top end of the net merit spectrum. And I know there's some milk cooperatives here in New York that have not made it mandatory, but strongly encouraged their producers to lean towards polled genetics and even A2A2, which is a totally another discussion, obviously. But I think to get in a world where we're dealing with all polled genetics would be obviously most ideal. I'd like to challenge any of the studs out there, any of the major studs, to make that a bigger focus to try to make that happen before regulatory agencies say it's this or nothing, right? And
Yeah.
I know they're working on it. That's obviously something that's happening, but just like anything, it's going to take time to breed those elite metric bulls that are also homozygous polled.
Yeah. And I know there has been, in my conversations with some of the geneticists and some of these companies, they have made huge improvements in terms of the merit. So I definitely think that the concerns about losing the quality or losing that merit is much less of a concern for a majority of the farms these days. So I definitely would encourage folks to, have a conversation with your semen rep and kind of encourage them to start to sell you some of the polled semen or request it from those companies, because in my conversations, I've found that the merit piece is much less of a concern. And the other fun fact is that the polled gene is actually dominant. So even if you're not using exclusively polled, if
Yeah,
any of the parents has the polled gene, that's going to be the
that's right.
dominant trait. So it's okay if you choose to use one versus the other. Like, definitely, you're still going to get the advantages. So definitely, I think, encourage folks to have those conversations and use polled genetics, and that for a majority of farms, the merit conversation is much less of a concern now.
And it's not impossible. I mean, you look at what we've done with Black Angus, the best example, limb flex.
Hmm.
So limousines came from Europe. They were red and horned, and
Hmm.
now we have brought them over. We've brought them up. There's these limb flex sires like Dr. Key Jim uses at Wolf Cattle Company and Feedlot, and they're black and polled now.
Hmm.
So
It's crazy what we can do.
it took a red horned animal and made him black and polled. So, Alycia, if you could just provide us with maybe like a 3 point recap of, what do you want the nutritionist listening right now, or the veterinary that's listening right now, herd owner manager that's listening right now, to take back with them and really consider?
Yeah. So first, I would say that disbudding is painful regardless of the method that you're using, whether it's hot iron or caustic paste. The calves are going to experience pain. And so because of that, we should be following best practice for pain relief and using multiple methods of pain relief. So by that, I mean the combination of a local block and an NSAID, and that should be provided at the time of the procedure. So point number one, painful no matter what, use pain relief. Point number two, if we can use the hot iron, that's going to be better for the calves. We're better able to mitigate the pain at the time of the procedure. We have fewer kind of secondary repercussions, I'll say, because the paste, for example, can get rubbed off onto the calf's head or onto other body parts and create secondary burns more readily. And we also see that the wounds heal much faster for the hot iron. So again, kind of 7 to 9 weeks compared to 14 to 18 weeks. So use hot iron whenever we possibly can to promote the best possible calf welfare. And then my third and final point would definitely be to start to switch to polled genetics if you can, and start to, incorporate that into your farm, because not performing the procedure is going to truly be the only way to avoid the pain for the calves, but then also, the stress and the hassle for the human side of things. every single conversation I've had with a dairyman or a dairy producer or their employees, everybody says they hate to do this chore or they hate to do this task, but they do it anyway. So I
Yeah.
really encourage folks to start to have those conversations, start to make the switch to things like pooled genetics, and then make it easier for everybody within the system, your employees, yourselves, whoever is doing this procedure, and also making it better for your calves would be definitely like the top recommendation, right?
It's funny. I'll ask people to give the recap as we're trying to close up the show. But then, as always, during the recap, you say something. And it's ironic because if you talk with a dairyman that what are the qualities you want to look for in the calf manager of your program? A lot of times you hear things like empathy.
Mm-hmm.
So great. And I agree. Like having a calf program manager that has empathy for the livestock that he or she is overseeing, great quality. And then what do? We ask them to go inflict pain on these animals. And obviously I'm making it sound worse maybe than what it is, but it's reality, right? It is reality. And so, I think there's times where we overlook what that does to the psyche of the people that are performing the job, right? And again, like you said, people have chosen the route of caustic paste because of the perceived convenience and perceived time saving, but really, as you said, that's really gone. The only way to actually capture that is going to be through the use of pooled genetics.
Definitely. Yeah, no, I can totally appreciate that. And I think you're right on with we want to select folks that have empathy and that have care for our animals because as an industry, that's what we want to embody and that's what we do for the most part embody. So
Yeah.
challenging the status quo and trying to do things that make sure that we uphold that for everybody, I think is beneficial.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Alycia, thank you for taking time out of your day today to visit with me all the way from the other side of the country. As she is in California, I'm over here in New York, obviously. And we'll be looking forward to talking to our audience again in 2 weeks with the CEO of Agrarian Solutions, Mr. Mark Carpenter. So thank you, Alycia, and have a great day.
Thank you, Scott. You as well.
Thank you for listening to Ruminate This with Agrarian Solutions. Look for our next episode in 2 weeks.